The large wooden doors felt heavier than she expected, as if they were trying to warn her to turn back before it was too late. She pushed against them with her shoulder, slipping quietly into the vast hall that smelled of old wax, expensive perfume, and centuries of musical history. It was the kind of place where people spoke in whispers, not out of respect for the music, but out of fear of disturbing the silence of the elite. She stood near the back entrance for a moment, clutching her worn folder of sheet music against her chest. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it thumping against her ribs, like a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the tempo of the song she had practiced. Looking around, she felt a sudden, sharp wave of insecurity wash over her. The hall was filling up quickly, but she didn't see anyone who looked like her. The other students gathered in small, tight circles near the stage. They were dressed in sharp blazers and soft wool coats that looked like they had never seen a rainy day. Their leather shoes clicked sharply on the polished marble floor. They spoke in a mix of languages, laughing politely at jokes she didn't understand, exchanging names of famous teachers and prestigious conservatories in Europe and America. They moved with a kind of easy confidence, a belief that they belonged here, that this grand hall was built for them. She looked down at her own shoes. They were clean, but the soles were worn smooth from walking miles to practice rooms that didn't have heat. Her skirt was simple, made of a fabric that didn't breathe well, and she had spent the last hour trying to smooth out the wrinkles with her hands on the bus ride over. She felt like a ghost haunting a party she hadn't been invited to. Taking a deep breath, she forced her feet to move. She walked toward the rows of velvet seats, looking for a spot that wouldn't draw attention. She found a seat in the very last row, tucked into a corner, shadowed by a heavy velvet curtain. It was safe there. She could see everything, but hopefully no one would see her. She sat down, the folder on her lap, and tried to make herself as small as possible. The stage in front of her was enormous. A single grand piano sat in the center of a spotlight, looking less like an instrument and more like a throne. It gleamed under the lights, its black surface reflecting the high arches of the ceiling. She stared at it, mesmerized and terrified. That was the piano she would have to play. It wasn't the upright with the sticky keys in the community center back home. It wasn't the digital keyboard she practiced on late at night with headphones so she wouldn't wake her neighbors. This was a beast, a machine that required power and precision. She suddenly felt very small. She thought about how she had even gotten here. It felt like a clerical error, a mistake in the universe. She had spent her life learning music through scrap-sold recordings found in thrift stores, library books with missing pages, and the kindness of a retired teacher who saw something in her hands even when she couldn't afford lessons. She had sent in an application video on a whim, recorded on a shaking phone in her dim living room. She never expected a reply. When the acceptance letter arrived, inviting her to this masterclass with the world's most celebrated pianist, she thought it was a prank, but now she was here. The reality of it was sinking in, heavy and cold. Around her, the atmosphere began to change. The hum of conversation died down. The students stopped laughing and straightened their postures. The heavy doors at the back of the hall opened again, and this time, a man walked in. She didn't need to see his face to know who it was. The air in the room seemed to tighten the moment he stepped inside. He walked with a stiff, robotic grace, his head held high, his eyes scanning the room as if he were inspecting merchandise rather than greeting students. He wore a dark suit that was perfectly tailored, hugging his frame in a way that suggested he spent more time in front of mirrors than most people spent sleeping. He was the maestro, the virtuoso, the man whose records sat in piles on her floor at home, the man whose playing could make grown men weep. He walked down the center aisle without acknowledging anyone. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just moved toward the stage like a king walking to his executioner's block. When he climbed the stairs, the room was completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench with precise movements, and then slowly opened the lid. The sound of the lid clicking into place echoed through the hall like a gunshot. He flexed his fingers, long and pale, before placing them on the keys. He didn't play a song. He just played a single, sharp chord, cutting through the silence like a knife. Too loud, he muttered, though no one had spoken. He adjusted something inside the piano, his back to the audience. This instrument is poorly maintained. From the back row, she felt a chill run down her spine. His voice was deep, commanding, and laced with a harsh accent that made every word sound like a judgment. He stood up and turned to face the rows of students. He didn't look at individuals. He looked at the crowd as a whole, dissecting them with his gaze. "I know why you are here," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly without a microphone. "You want to be famous? You want to be like me? You think that because you can hit the right notes, you are musicians." He began to pace the stage, his hands clasped behind his back. "You are wrong," he continued. "Most of you are technicians. You are typists of the keyboard. You have speed, you have accuracy, but you have no soul. I am going to spend today crushing that out of you. I will break you until only the music remains. And for most of you," he paused, letting his eyes drift over the expensive clothes and the confident faces, "there will be nothing left." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The girl in the back row felt her stomach turn over. She pulled her feet closer to the chair, trying to disappear into the red velvet. This was worse than she had imagined. She had expected a teacher who was strict, maybe demanding, but this man seemed to hate them. He seemed to resent their existence. "We will begin with someone," the maestro said, looking down at a clipboard he had left on the music rack. He frowned, his lip curling in disgust. "We will start with the unexpected one." He looked up, scanning the rows. The girl in the corner stopped breathing. She knew, with a horrible certainty, that he was looking for her. She didn't know how he knew, but he could sense the fear. He could smell the mediocrity he assumed she possessed. "You there?" he said, pointing a finger toward the back of the room. "In the corner, you are hiding. Come here for a second." She couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. The students around her turned their heads, a sea of curious, judgmental eyes staring at her. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks. There was no escape. She stood up, her knees shaking so badly she had to hold onto the back of the seat in front of her to steady herself. She grabbed her folder. The walk to the stage felt like a mile long, an endless journey across a frozen sea. She could feel the weight of every stare. The silent mockery of the elite students who were relieved they weren't the first. One's called as she climbed the stairs to the stage. The maestro watched her with a look of bored amusement. She stepped into the light, the brightness blinding her for a moment. She could smell the cologne he was wearing, something sharp and chemical that made her feel lightheaded. "What is your name?" he asked, though he didn't look at her face. He was looking at her shoes, she told him, her voice barely a squeak. "Speak up," he barked. "I cannot hear you. Are you a mouse or a musician?" She said her name again, louder this time, trying to find a scrap of courage. "And where do you come from?" he asked. "Which conservatory produced you?" "I don't go to a conservatory, sir," she whispered. The maestro let out a short, sharp laugh. It echoed in the hall, and she heard a ripple of laughter from the students in the front row. "No conservatory?" he repeated, feigning shock. "So we are to waste our time on an amateur? This is a master class, not a charity event." He walked over to the piano and sat down, gesturing for her to sit on the bench beside him. She sat down, terrified. Her hands were hovering over the keys, trembling. The piano smelled like lemon polish and dust. "Let us see what you have," he said, crossing his arms. "Play something." She opened her folder. Her hands were shaking so much she nearly dropped the pages. The music was a simple transcription of a folk song, something she had arranged herself. It wasn't a complex concerto by Rachmaninoff or a sonata by Beethoven. It was a simple melody, but it meant everything to her. She placed her hands on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth. She took a breath, trying to remember why she loved music, trying to remember the feeling of the music in her heart. Pushing away the fear of the man sitting inches away from her, she began to play. It was a soft, hesitant start. She hit the first few notes cleanly, but her timing was slightly off. She rushed, trying to get through it, trying to get it over with. The maestro's presence was suffocating. She could feel him watching her hands, critiquing every twitch of a finger, every breath she took. She wasn't playing the music. She was trying to survive it. Suddenly, his hand came down on the keys, slamming a discordant mash of notes that cut through her melody like a siren. She flinched, pulling her hands away as if she had been burned. "Stop," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Just stop." He turned to look at her finally, his eyes cold and dead. The first note she struck wasn't the polite, careful sound of a student trying to please a teacher. It was a growl. It was a low, deep note that seemed to come from the bottom of her stomach, traveling through her arm and vibrating into the wood of the piano. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, like the smell of rain before a storm. The maestro, who had already turned away to look at his clipboard, froze. His back stiffened. He clearly expected her to fumble, to play the same simple, broken tune she had attempted earlier. He was ready to wave his hand and shout for security to remove her. But that sound, that deep, resonant growl, made him pause. It wasn't a mistake. She didn't wait for his permission. She didn't wait for him to turn back around. She let her right hand fall onto the keys, playing a melody that was jagged and sharp. It wasn't smooth or pretty in the way the expensive music played by the other students was pretty. It was rough. It sounded like a fight. From her seat in the back of the hall just moments ago, she had felt invisible. But now, sitting on the bench, she felt massive. She closed her eyes tight, shutting out the bright lights and the silhouette of the man standing near the piano. She shut out the memory of his laughter. She reached for the place inside her where she kept her anger and her loneliness. The place where she stored every time someone had looked down on her because of her clothes or her accent. Her fingers began to move faster. The song didn't have a name, at least not one she had told anyone. It was a collection of sounds she had been hearing in her head for years. It started slowly, dragging itself along like a tired traveler. The rhythm was uneven, speeding up and slowing down, mimicking the unsteady beat of a nervous heart. The students in the audience, who had been whispering and giggling just seconds before, went quiet. It wasn't the respectful silence of the concert hall. It was the confused silence of people who didn't know what they were hearing. They looked at each other, raising their eyebrows. Is she allowed to do this? They seemed to be asking, is this even music? The maestro turned around slowly. His face was a mask of irritation. He opened his mouth to speak, to scold her for her lack of discipline, to tell her that rhythm was the foundation of music and she had none. But the words died in his throat, because the music changed. Suddenly, the jagged low notes began to climb. They spiraled upward, lighter and faster, like a bird trying to break free from a cage. Her left hand kept the heavy, sad rhythm on the lower keys, while her right hand danced wildly on the high keys. The contrast was jarring. It sounded like hope fighting against despair. It wasn't technically perfect. Her fingers slipped once, hitting a key slightly wrong, but she didn't stop. She didn't correct it. She used the mistake, leaning into it, making the wrong note sound like a cry of pain. She wasn't reading notes anymore. She wasn't thinking about sharps or flats or scales. She was remembering. She remembered the cold nights she spent practicing in a room that was too small, wearing a coat because the heater was broken. She remembered the feeling of her fingers being numb, stinging as they touched the cold keys of that old, upright piano. She poured that coldness into the music. But she also poured in the fire of her determination to keep going. The sound filled the hall. It bounced off the high ceiling and the velvet curtains. It was louder than she looked, louder than her small frame suggested she could be. She was hitting the keys harder now, her arms rising and falling with the force of the emotion. She wasn't hitting them to break them. She was hitting them to wake them up. In the third row, a young man in a designer suit stopped checking his watch. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the stage. He had been trained to appreciate the perfect geometry of a Bach fugue, the mathematical beauty of a Mozart sonata. This was neither. It was chaotic. It was messy, but it was alive in a way he had never heard before. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a feeling he couldn't explain. The maestro took a step closer to the piano. He crossed his arms, trying to hold on to his anger, trying to find a flaw he could attack. He looked at her posture. It was all wrong. She was hunched over, her face too close to the keys. He looked at her technique. It was raw, almost violent. But every time he tried to focus on a mistake, the melody pulled him away. The melody was telling a story that was heartbreaking and furious all at once. She entered a new section of the song. The frantic high notes slowed down, melting into a soft, gentle stream of music. It was like the sun coming out after a storm. The tempo became steady, a calm walking rhythm. Her hands moved in sync now, flowing up and down the keyboard like water. The harshness was gone, replaced by a deep, aching beauty. It was the sound of forgiveness, of accepting the hard things in life. The young woman on the bench wasn't sweating anymore. The terror had vanished. She was floating. She wasn't aware of the hundreds of eyes watching her. She wasn't aware of the famous pianist standing a few feet away. In her mind, she was back in her little room, but the room wasn't cold anymore. It was warm and filled with light. She was playing for herself, for the little girl who dreamed of pianos she couldn't afford. The silence in the room deepened. It wasn't just that people were quiet. They were holding their breath. You could feel the atmosphere change. The air in the hall felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The arrogance that had filled the room earlier, the thick cloud of superiority that the maestro and the students had worn like cloaks, was being sucked away by the music. The maestro's face twitched. He was a man who believed that control was the most important thing in the world. He controlled his hands, his breathing, his audience. He hated things he couldn't control. And this girl, this music was completely out of control? It was wild. It was dangerous. And yet, he couldn't look away. He watched her left hand playing a complicated pattern of bass notes that supported the melody. It wasn't the kind of pattern taught in schools. It was unique. It was strange. But it worked. He found himself unconsciously tapping his foot, just for a second, before he caught himself and stopped. Angry that he had been drawn in, she began to build toward the climax. The volume swelled. She wasn't just pressing the keys. She was leaning her entire body into the sound. The piano was singing, screaming, crying. It was a wall of sound that washed over the audience, hitting them in the chest. The girl in the corner, the one who had been invisible, was commanding the army of the orchestra with just two hands, the students. The ones who had laughed at her shoes, the ones who had looked at her with pity, were now staring at her with open mouths. They realized they were witnessing something that couldn't be taught in a conservatory. You could buy 100 lessons. You could practice for 10 hours a day, but you couldn't buy whatever she had. You couldn't practice that kind of honesty. She was bleeding onto the keys, and it was terrifying and beautiful. The maestro's jaw tightened. He looked at the audience, then back at the girl. He realized he was losing the room. The power had shifted. The center of gravity was no longer him standing on the stage. It was her sitting at the piano. He hated it. It felt like a physical blow to his ego. But a small, quiet voice in the back of his mind, a voice he hadn't listened to in years, whispered that she was doing something he had forgotten how to do. She was playing with truth. The music rushed forward like a river breaking a dam. The notes were cascading down, a waterfall of sound. Her hands were a blur of motion. The climax of the song wasn't just loud. It was overwhelming. It felt like the end of the world, a crashing, thundering wave that threatened to drown them all. She was playing with everything she had, putting every ounce of her life force into the instrument. She was screaming without opening her mouth, and then suddenly it stopped. She didn't fade out. She didn't play a soft, gentle ending. She stopped on a single high chord that rang out like a crystal bell in the silence. Her hands lifted off the keys and hovered in the air for a split second. Frozen in the posture of the music, she pulled her hands back to her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Her palms were wet. The adrenaline was rushing through her veins, making her head spin. She opened her eyes slowly, the bright lights of the stage blinding her again. The world came rushing back. The smell of the wax, the dust, the silence. She sat there, hunched over, waiting for the reaction. Part of her expected the maestro to yell. She expected him to say it was garbage, that it was a disgrace, that she was crazy. She steeled herself for the insults. ready to run off the stage and never play again. But there was nothing. No one spoke. No one moved. No one clapped. The silence that followed her playing was different from the silence before. Before, it was an empty silence, a waiting silence. This silence was heavy. It was full. It was as if the music had sucked all the air out of the room, leaving a vacuum that no one dared to fill. The final chord she had struck seemed to hang in the air, vibrating, refusing to die away. The maestro stood like a statue. His clipboard was lowered to his side, forgotten. His usual mask of arrogance was cracked, replaced by a look of total blankness. He was staring at her, but he wasn't seeing the girl in the cheap clothes. He was seeing something he couldn't understand. The silence in the hall was not empty. It was heavy. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the shoulders of everyone sitting in the velvet seats. The final vibration of the piano string had faded into the air long ago, but the feeling of the music was still trapped in the room. Bouncing off the walls, refusing to leave, the young woman sat on the bench. Her back stiff, her hands resting in her lap. She was staring at the white and black keys, but she wasn't really seeing them. Her ears were ringing with the echoes of what she had just done, and her heart was hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She felt exposed. It was the same feeling she had had when she first walked onto the stage, but magnified 1,000 times. When she plays at home, in her small, quiet room, the music is a private thing. It is a secret between her and the instrument. But here, she had ripped her chest open and poured her heart out for 300 strangers. And now, in the crushing silence, she regretted it. She waited for the sound of a cough. She waited for a whisper. She waited for the maestro to laugh. In her mind, the script was already written. He would stand up, brush a speck of dust from his sleeve, and tell her that she was hysterical, that she was undisciplined, that she had just made a fool of herself in front of the most important people in the musical world. He's going to destroy me, she thought. The panic began to rise in her throat, tasting like bile. I shouldn't have done it. I should have just played the boring piece and left. Who was I to think I could play like that? She started to slide off the bench. Her legs felt like water. She just wanted to grab her folder, run down the center aisle, and burst out into the fresh air where nobody knew her name. She wanted to disappear. Sit. The word was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a whip crack. The girl froze. One foot touching the floor, one hand still gripping the edge of the piano bench. She slowly looked up. The maestro hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, a few feet away from the piano. His arms were still crossed, but his face was different. The smirk was gone. The look of bored amusement had vanished. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was curiosity. He took a slow step toward her, then another. The sound of his leather shoe on the wood floor was painfully loud in the quiet room. He walked past her, behind the bench, and stopped. He was standing so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the insult. I did not tell you to move, he said softly. His voice lacked the booming arrogance from before. It was lower, almost a whisper. The girl sat back down on the bench, her hands trembling so hard she had to clasp them together to keep them still. The maestro leaned over her. He didn't look at her. He looked at the piano keys. He stared at them as if they were a stranger, as if they had suddenly changed shape and color. He reached out a hand, his long pale fingers hovering over the ivory, but he didn't touch them. He seemed afraid to touch them, as if the heat from her playing had burned the surface. What was that? He asked. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It wasn't the kind of question teachers ask when they already know the answer. It was a genuine question. He sounded confused. He sounded lost. The girl licked her dry lips. It was just a song, sir. An arrangement. Don't lie to me, he snapped, though there was no malice in it. I have heard every song written in the last 300 years. I know the repertoire. That was not a song. That was a scream. He walked around the bench and stood in front of the audience, blocking her view of the crowd. He looked out at the rows of students. They were still staring, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide. Tell them, the maestro said to the students, his voice gaining a little strength. Tell her what she did wrong. She broke the tempo. She ignored the dynamics. She played with the pedal down when she should have lifted it. Technically, it was a disaster. Was it not? He waited for them to agree. He waited for them to list the mistakes, but the students didn't speak. The young man in the third row looked down at his shoes. A girl in the front row shook her head almost imperceptibly. No one wanted to say it. No one wanted to be the one to break the spell. The maestro turned back to her. He looked frustrated. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. Why are you not writing this down? He shouted at the students. This is what happens when you have no discipline. This is the result of ignorance. He stopped shouting. He looked at the girl again. His eyes were intense, searching her face for cracks. But he said the word hanging in the air. But he paced back to the piano. He placed his hands on the keys and played a complex chord, perfectly executed, perfectly timed. It sounded beautiful, but after what the girl had played, it sounded like glass. It sounded cold and fragile. I played that perfectly, the maestro said, looking at his hands. Why does it not sound like yours? He looked at the girl, and for the first time, he didn't see a poor student in cheap clothes. He saw a peer, and it terrified him. You play like you have nothing to lose, he said. I play like I have everything to lose. That is the difference. The girl sat up a little straighter. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to confess something so real. I just play how I feel, sir, she said softly. I don't know how else to play. Feeling is cheap, he spat, but the words had no force. Everyone has feelings. The world is full of people who feel. Art is not about feeling. It is about control. Then why did you stop me? She asked. The question was out of her mouth before she could stop it. It was the bravest thing she had ever done. The maestro stared at her. I stopped you because you were frightening me, he said. The silence that followed was absolute. The students in the hall gasped softly. The maestro, the great virtuoso, the king of the piano, had just admitted to being frightened by a student. He turned away from her, walking to the edge of the stage. He looked up at the high ceiling, his hands clasped behind his back. He seemed to be wrestling with something inside himself. A ghost from his past, perhaps. He remembered a time before the fame and the suits and the money when he used to play like that. When he used to play because he loved it, not because he was being paid to be perfect. He had spent 40 years learning how to be perfect, and in the process, he had forgotten how to be alive. He turned back to the room, his voice regaining its command, but softer now, gentler. You asked for a second chance, he said to the girl. You took it. You played your piece. He paused. He looked at the sheet music lying on the rack, the notes she had ignored. You are not ready for this world, he said. This world will eat you alive. It will take your raw talent, and it will package it, and it will sell it until there is nothing left of you. He walked back to the bench. He didn't sit down. He stood next to her. But he said, looking down at her, you have something that I cannot teach, and that makes me very angry. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a smile of respect, grudging and hard-won. You play the piano like it is a weapon, he said. I have spent my life treating it like a museum piece. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a white handkerchief. He wiped his forehead, which was damp with sweat. The performance had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Stand up, he said. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak. She held her folder against her chest, her heart still racing. She expected him to tell her to leave. She expected him to say she was expelled. She had made a scene. She had humiliated him, even if he didn't realize it yet. Class is over, the maestro announced to the room. Get out. All of you. Go home. The students looked at each other, confused. They began to gather their things, the spell finally breaking as the noise of shuffling papers and zipping bags filled the room. They moved slowly, their eyes still on the girl and the maestro. They didn't want to leave. They wanted to know what happened next. But the maestro stood with his back to them, ignoring them completely. his focus entirely on the young woman standing by the piano as the hall emptied. The noise faded away, replaced once again by the quiet hum of the building. The last student closed the heavy wooden doors with a thud. Now, it was just the two of them in the vast, empty hall. The girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Sir," she whispered, "I am sorry if I embarrassed you. I just—" "Stop apologizing," he snapped. He sighed a long, tired exhale. He looked at the piano, then at her. "Do you know how many people play for me every year? Thousands. Students, prodigies, professors. They all play the notes. They play the dots on the page, and they all bore me to death." He walked toward the stairs that led off the stage, then stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "What you played today?" "It was ugly," he said. "It was painful. It was rough." The girl lowered her head, tears stinging her eyes again. "It was also the most beautiful thing I have heard in 20 years, he finished. She looked up, shocked. "Don't look so surprised," he grumbled. "I am old, not dead." He started walking down the stairs. "You may stay," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Practice. But do not play that song again. Not for anyone. It is too dangerous." "Why?" she called out, her voice trembling. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't turn around. The heavy doors of the concert hall clicked shut, leaving her alone in the vast space. The echo of the maestro's footsteps had faded long ago, but the silence he left behind felt different now. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a charged silence, like the air right after a lightning strike. She sat at the piano for a long time, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, afraid to play a note but terrified to leave. Eventually, the custodian came in to turn off the lights. A silent signal that the dream was over for the night. She gathered her worn folder and walked out into the cool evening air. Her legs felt weak, as if she had run a marathon, but her heart was light. She had survived. She had spoken the only language she truly knew, and for a few moments, the world had stopped to listen. The next morning, the atmosphere at the conservatory had shifted completely. When she walked into the main practice building, carrying her usual bag and wearing her simple coat, the students didn't ignore her. They didn't whisper behind her back. They stopped. They stepped aside to let her pass. Some of them looked at her with envy, others with fear, and a few with a strange kind of reverence. She was no longer the poor girl from the wrong side of town. She was the one who had made the maestro speechless. She found her usual practice room a small, cramped space with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. She sat down and opened her folder. She tried to practice her scales, trying to get her fingers to move smoothly, but her mind was racing. The maestro's words kept echoing in her head. It was too dangerous. When she entered the masterclass hall later that day, the air was thick with tension. The other students were already there, sitting up straight, trying to look like they were ready for war. The maestro stood on the stage, his back to them, examining the piano. When he heard the door open, he turned. His eyes swept over the room, ignoring the rich students, the scholarship winners, and the prodigies. They landed instantly on her. "You," he said. "Come here." She walked to the stage, her heart pounding. She felt the eyes of every student boring into her back. She climbed the stairs and stood next to him. "Do not think that yesterday makes you special," he said, his voice low so only she could hear. "Do not think that because you cried a little and played a sad tune, you are a genius. You are rough. You are unformed clay." "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Today," he announced to the room, "we are going to fix you." He pointed to the bench. "Sit." For the next 3 hours, he worked her harder than she had ever been worked in her life. He didn't let her play her dangerous song. Instead, he made her play a simple Samajo scale. Up and down. Up and down. Every time her wrist dropped, he tapped it hard with a ruler. Every time her rhythm wavered, he stopped her with a sharp shout. "No. You are rushing." "Why are you rushing?" "Life is long. Music is long." He was cruel, but it wasn't the cruelty of mockery. It was the cruelty of a sculptor chiseling away at stone. He was breaking her habits. He was forcing her hands to move in ways that felt unnatural. fighting against the instincts she had taught herself over the years. By the end of the session, her arms were aching. Her fingers felt like they were on fire. She was sweating and exhausted. She felt like she had forgotten how to play. "Terrible," the maestro said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "Go home. Practice your scales. If I hear that sloppy song again, I will throw you out myself." She walked off the stage, defeated and confused. The other students wouldn't look at her. They were terrified that they would be next. This routine continued for days. Every morning, she would practice until her fingers bled. Every afternoon, the maestro would dissect her playing, finding every flaw, every hesitation, every uneven note. He stripped away her confidence until she felt like a beginner again. She stopped feeling the music. She started counting beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Music became math. It became logic. She hated it. She hated him. She missed the raw, wild feeling of playing from her soul. She felt like she was burying her true self under a mountain of rules. One rainy evening, late in the week, she was the last one in the building. The rain was hammering against the windows, matching the storm in her heart. She sat in the practice room, staring at the keys. She wasn't playing. She was just sitting there, wondering if she should quit. Maybe the maestro was right. Maybe she wasn't a musician. Maybe she was just a girl with a lot of noise inside her. The door to the practice room creaked open. She jumped, turning around. The maestro was standing in the doorway. He was wearing a long coat and holding an umbrella. He looked tired. His face looked older in the dim light. "Why are you not playing?" he asked. "I can't," she said honestly. "I don't feel anything anymore." "You took it away." The maestro walked into the room and closed the door. He leaned against the wall, watching the rain streak the window. "I didn't take it away," he said quietly. "I hid it." She looked at him, confused. "Emotion is easy," he said, turning to look at her. "Anyone can cry. Anyone can get angry and bang on the keys. That is not art. That is just noise. To truly move people, to truly break their hearts, you have to hide the emotion. You have to bury it deep inside the structure. You have to build a cage of perfect technique to hold the monster inside." He walked over to the piano. He placed one hand on the lid. "If the cage is weak," he said softly, "the monster escapes too soon, and it just scares people. But if the cage is strong, if the technique is perfect, then the monster beats against the bars, and the people can feel the fury without seeing it. That is what makes them scream. That is the difference between a child throwing a tantrum and a master telling a tragedy." He looked at her hands. "Your cage was made of paper," he said. "I am teaching you to build it out of iron." She sat there, stunned. She looked down at her hands. The calluses on her fingertips were harder now. Her fingers moved faster, more independently. He hadn't tried to silence her. He had tried to give her the power to control the sound. "Tomorrow is the final concert," the maestro said. "The critics will be there. The wealthy donors will be there. They will be expecting a show. They will be expecting me to present the best students in the world." He pushed himself off the piano and walked to the door. "Do not play the folk song," he said. "It is not good enough for you anymore. Play the piece I gave you. The difficult one. The etude." She asked, her voice trembling. "But it's so fast. And it's cold. It has no soul." The maestro smiled, a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Then give it a soul," he said. "Take your monster out of the paper box and put it in the iron cage. Play the notes perfectly. But make the music scream." He opened the door and left, leaving the scent of rain and expensive tobacco in the air. The girl sat alone in the practice room for a long time. The rain stopped. The room grew dark. She placed her hands on the keys. She thought about the iron cage. She thought about the monster inside, heard the anger, the hunger, the loneliness. She thought about the maestro's words. She began to play. She didn't play the folk song. She played the etude. It was a blur of notes, a dizzying staircase of sound. At first, she played it carefully, counting the beats. But then, She remembered the feeling of the night she had silenced the room. She remembered the cold of her old apartment, the heat of her anger. She poured that fire into the cold notes. She kept the rhythm perfect. She made her fingers strike the keys with machine-like precision. But underneath the precision, she pushed the emotion. She made the piano growl while staying perfectly in tune. She made the notes weep while staying perfectly on time. It felt like holding back a dam with her bare hands. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. The next evening, the hall was packed. The air buzzed with the sound of expensive chatter and clinking glasses. The audience was dressed in jewels and tuxedos, the elite of the elite. They were there to see the maestro's students perform like trained monkeys. One by one, the students played. They were perfect. They played fast, they played loud, and they played clean. The audience applauded politely. "Lovely technique," they whispered. Very precise, but no one cried. No one stopped breathing. It was just noise. Finally, the announcer called her name. There was a ripple of murmurs. People remembered the rumors of the outsider who had caused a scene earlier in the week. She walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding. She couldn't see the audience, but she could feel them. She could feel their judgment, their skepticism. She sat at the piano. The maestro stood in the wings, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. She closed her eyes for a split second. She saw the iron cage. She saw the monster inside. She lifted her hands. She began to play. It wasn't the soft, hesitant start of her earlier performance. She attacked the piece. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with a speed that blurred in the light. It was a technical marvel, a display of skill that the other students couldn't match. She was playing the maestro's game, playing by his rules, hitting every note with absolute precision. The audience leaned forward, impressed by the speed. But then she changed. She didn't change the notes. She didn't change the rhythm. She changed the intention. She pushed the feeling into the pressure of the keys. She made the fast notes sound like a swarm of angry bees. She made the slow notes sound like a funeral bell. She was controlling the chaos with an iron grip.